General knowledge, questions with answers on biology, especially DNA and RNA, viruses, bacteria. What is DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid is a molecule composed of two polynucleotide chains that coil around each other to form a double helix carrying genetic instructions for the development, functioning, growth, and reproduction of all known organisms and many viruses. DNA and ribonucleic acids are nucleic acids. It is the hereditary material in humans and almost all other organisms. Nearly every cell in a person's body has the same DNA. What is DNA made of? DNA is made of chemical building blocks called nucleotides. These building blocks are made of three parts: a phosphate group, a sugar group, and one of four types of nitrogen bases. To form a strand of DNA, nucleotides are linked into chains with the phosphate and sugar groups alternating. Who gave the term virus? Bajornik. In 1892, Ivanovsky demonstrated the presence of infectious agents coined virus by Bajornik in 1898 in filtrate of infected leaves passed through a Chamberlain filter. This marks the discovery of the tobacco mosaic virus and the birth of a new era in virology. When was the first human virus discovered? Following on from the discovery of tobacco mosaic virus in 1892 and foot and mouth disease virus in 1898, the first filterable agent to be discovered in humans was yellow fever virus in 1901 AD. Where did the first virus come from? Viruses may have arisen from mobile genetic elements that gained the ability to move between cells. They may be descendants of previously free living organisms that adopted a parasitic replication strategy. Perhaps viruses existed before and led to the evolution of cellular life. Who invented bacteria? Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Two men are created today with the discovery of microorganisms using primitive microscopes. Robert Hooke, who described the fruiting structures of molds in 1665, and Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who is created with the discovery of bacteria in 1676 AD. Is a virus a life form? Viruses are considered by some biologists to be a life form because they carry genetic material, reproduce, and evolve through natural selection, although they lack the key characteristics such as cell structure that are generally considered necessary criteria for life. Do viruses have DNA? Most viruses have either RNA or DNA as their genetic material. The nucleic acid may be single or double stranded. The entire infectious virus particle, called a virion, consists of the nucleic acid and an outer shell of protein. The simple viruses contain only enough RNA or DNA to encode four proteins. Why DNA is called an acid? DNA or RNA are called nucleic acids because of the acidic nature of the phosphate group attached to them. Hence, it is the acidic part of the molecule that dominates, and that is why we know DNA as an acid. How does DNA control your life? The nucleotide sequences that make up DNA are a code for the cell to make hundreds of different types of proteins. It is these proteins that function to control and regulate cell growth, division, communication with other cells, and most other cellular functions. This process is called protein synthesis. What are the four types of nucleotides? Because there are four naturally occurring nitrogenous bases, there are four different types of DNA nucleotides: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. What is the difference between nucleotides and nucleic acids? Nucleotides are the monomers that make up a nucleic acid, such as DNA or RNA. Nucleic acids are made of long strands of nucleotides and are an essential part of every living thing. What do nucleotides do? A nucleotide is an organic molecule that is the building block of DNA or RNA. They also have functions related to cell signaling, metabolism, and enzyme reactions. A nucleotide is made up of three parts: a phosphate group, a 5 carbon sugar, and a nitrogenous base. What are the functions of DNA? The four roles DNA play are replication, encoding information, mutation or recombination, and gene expression. Replication. DNA exists in a double helical arrangement in which each base along one strand binds to a complementary base on the other strand. Encoding information, mutation and recombination. Last one, gene expression. What is DNA found in? Researchers refer to DNA found in the cell's nucleus as nuclear DNA. An organism's complete set of nuclear DNA is called as its genome. Besides the DNA located in the nucleus, humans and other complex organisms also have a small amount of DNA in cell structures known as mitochondria. How is DNA used in our everyday lives? DNA is a unique to every individual. Doctors and scientists can use genetic information that can diagnose, treat, prevent, and cure many illnesses and even mutation conditions. In recent years, DNA has been used frequently for criminal cases. It has helped in ensuring that an innocent person is not put behind bars. How much DNA is in a cell? Most cells in our body have two copies of the genome with 6 billion base pairs of deoxyribonucleic acid. What is the difference between DNA and genes? Genes are made up of DNA or RNA, while the DNA is made up of the long chain of polynucleotides with adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine bases in it. A gene transfers information for a specific trait, while the DNA transfers all the information for all the traits as well as to regulate gene expression. What is DNA function and structure? DNA is made up of molecules called nucleotides. Each nucleotide contains a phosphate group, a sugar group, and a nitrogen base. The four types of nitrogen bases are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. The order of these bases is what it determines DNA's instructions or genetic code. Is there DNA in fruit crop banana? It holds a stringy substance called DNA, which is like a set of blueprints or instructions. DNA contains a code for how to build a life form and put together the features that make that organism unique, just like us. Banana plant have genes and DNA in their cells, and just like us, their DNA determines their traits. Is DNA considered alive? Is DNA alive? No, it is not alive mostly. The only sense in which a DNA molecule is a living thing is that it makes copies of itself, although it cannot even do that on its own. Viruses are bundles of DNA that become active only when they are inside a cell, at which point they take over the cell and gives us the flu or like disease. Who is the father of DNA fingerprinting in world? Professor Sir Alec Jeffrey. You could say that the path that led to the discovery of genetic fingerprinting began for Professor Alec Jeffrey when his father gave him a chemistry set and a microscope at the age of 8. Who invented DNA? Many people believe that American biologist James Watson and English physicist Francis Crick discovered DNA in the year 1950s. In reality, this is not the case. Rather, DNA was first identified in the late 1860s by Swiss chemist Friedrich Mischer. What is a coronavirus? The coronavirus COVID-19 is a member of the virus family Coronaviridae or coronaviruses. The name comes from the appearance of the virus particles under a microscope. Tiny protein protrusions on their surfaces mean they appear surrounded by a hollow-like corona. Other coronaviruses were responsible for deadly outbreaks of serious acute respiratory syndrome SARS in China in 2003 and Middle East respiratory syndrome MERS from 2012. These viruses mutate relatively often in ways that allow them to be transmitted to humans. Where do nucleotides come from? Dietary nucleotides, as their name implies, come from our diet. These are termed exogenous since they are created external to our body from various food sources. Our body can also create nucleotides. These are referred to as the endogenous since they are created within. Where can nucleotides be found? Nucleotides are the building blocks that constitute the RNA biopolymers found within living cells. Messenger RNA, that is mRNA, transfer RNA, tRNA, ribosomal RNA, rRNA, and long and small non coding RNAs. Are viruses older than bacteria? Viruses did not evolve first, they found instead. Viruses and bacteria both descended from an ancient cellular life forms, but while like humans, bacteria evolved to become more complex. Viruses became simpler today. Viruses are so small and simple they cannot even replicate on their own. Did Ebola virus come from bats? Scientists do not know where Ebola virus comes from. However, based on the nature of similar viruses, they believed that the virus is animal born, with bats or non human primates, chimpanzees, apes, monkeys, etc., being the most likely source. How fast do viruses reproduce? Cells infected with non-lytic viruses may continue to synthesize viruses indefinitely. The reproductive cycle of viruses ranges from 18 hours to more than 72 hours. The virus yields per cell ranges from more than 100,000 poliovirus particles to several thousands poxvirus particles. How DNA affects our lives? Your DNA and genes determine certain traits such as height and eye color as well as how our body functions. For example, your genes can determine whether you are likely to have food intolerances, vitamin deficiencies, how you metabolize different parts of your diet, and aspects of your skin's reaction to sunlight. Is DNA different from person to person? DNA is a powerful tool because each person's DNA is different from every other individual's except for identical twins. Because of that difference, DNA collected from a crime scene can either link a suspect to the evidence or eliminate a suspect, similar to the use of fingerprints. It also can identify a victim through DNA from relatives even when nobody can be found. Where is DNA contained in the human body? DNA is contained in blood, semen, skin cells, tissue, organs, muscle, brain cells, bone, teeth, hair, saliva, mucus, perspiration, fingernails, urine, feces, etc. How much DNA is in a cell? Most cells in our body have two copies of the genome with 6 billion base pairs of DNA. Your DNA has the instructions for making you. One complete set of instructions is called a genome. These instructions are written in letters called base pairs. A human genome has around 3 billion base pairs. The reason you are sometimes see the 6 billion number has to do with how your DNA is stored in your body. Your body is made up of trillions of cells. Each of these cells has two copies of your genome. Why do viruses use RNA instead of DNA? RNA viruses have RNA for their nucleic acid cells, and DNA viruses have DNA which they use to make RNA. RNA viruses have RNA and use it to make DNA. This leads to a truly mind-boggling ability. The DNA these viruses make can become permanently incorporated into the DNA of the host cells, a process called transduction. Can a virus alter your DNA? Viral transformation is the change in growth, phenotype, or indefinite reproduction of cells caused by the introduction of inheritable material. Through this process, a virus causes harmful transformations of an in vivo cell or cell culture. The term can also be understood as DNA transfection using a viral vector. How are viruses evolved and made of? Over 4,800 species of viruses have been described in detail. Out of the millions in the environment, their origin is unclear. Some may have evolved from plasmids, pieces of DNA that can move between cells, while others may have evolved from bacteria. Viruses are made of either two or three parts. All include genes. These genes contain the encoded biological information of the virus and are built from either DNA or RNA. Who started DNA testing? In 1986 was when DNA was first used in a criminal investigation by Dr. Jeffrey. 1986. The investigation used genetic fingerprinting in a case of two rapes and murders that had happened in 1983 and 1986. Does our DNA have memory? Memories are passed through DNA from your grandparents, say scientists. New studies suggest that some of our memories, fears, and behaviors are passed down genetically through generations from our ancestors. Can DNA change in a lifetime? Our genome changes over lifetime. Researchers have found that epigenetic marks on DNA, chemical marks other than the DNA sequence, do indeed change over a person's lifetime, and that the degree of change is similar among family members. What happens to your DNA when we die? Cells continue to function even after an individual dies. That is, according to a scientific study published in Nature Communications. Analyzing post-mortem samples, an international team of scientists showed that some genes became more active after death. Do viruses have DNA? Most viruses have either RNA or DNA as their genetic material. The nucleic acid may be single or double stranded. The entire infectious viruses particles called a virion consist of the nucleic acid and an outer shell of protein. The simplest viruses contain only enough RNA or DNA to encode four proteins. Which viruses are RNA viruses? Human diseases causing RNA viruses include orthomyxoviruses, hepatitis C virus that is HCV, Ebola diseases, SARS, influenza, polio, measles, and retrovirus, including adult human T cell lymphotrophic virus type 1 and human immunodeficiency virus that is HIV. Are RNA viruses man made? RNA viruses have historically been utilized due to the typically small genome size and existing reverse transcription machinery present. The first man made infectious viruses generated without any natural template were of the poliovirus and the bacteriophage.